In a quiet neighborhood park, a single act of prejudice sets off a powerful chain of events. A black mother is out enjoying the day with her adopted white son when a bystander makes a chilling decision. Her actions, based on nothing more than assumption, lead to an encounter that neither of them will ever forget. The mother, already familiar with judgment, faces one of her toughest moments yet. But this story isn't just about prejudice, it's about how a single act of kindness can dismantle years of bias. Before we dive into this eye-opening story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories like this. Vanessa sat on the bench near the swings, watching Ethan, her 5-year-old son, laugh as he kicked up dust with his small feet. His bright blonde hair bounced in the sunlight as he tried to race with the other kids. Vanessa smiled warmly, feeling a sense of peace she rarely had time for. The park was full of life that Saturday, families picnicking, children running freely, and the sound of birds chirping overhead. Vanessa had brought Ethan here for their usual weekend visit, a tradition that started after the adoption was finalized. Being a single mother hadn't been easy, but every time she saw Ethan smile, it was a reminder that it was all worth it. She loved him more than anything, and he loved her back, without a doubt in his young, innocent heart. Their bond was undeniable. As Ethan ran toward the swings, Vanessa stood to follow, staying close but giving him enough space to play with the other kids. She sat back down when she saw him safely playing with 2 other children. These peaceful moments were the ones Vanessa cherished most. Life had been busy since she adopted Ethan, but days like this made her realize how lucky she was to have him. He had been her light through some of the darkest times in her life. Nearby, Emily watched from another bench, her eyes fixed on Vanessa and Ethan. She didn't know Vanessa personally, but she had seen her around the neighborhood a few times. Emily had always been active in the community, a frequent volunteer at local events and always involved in keeping the neighborhood safe. She had built a reputation for being friendly and approachable, but as she watched the interaction between Vanessa and Ethan, something didn't sit right with her. Her brows furrowed as she tried to piece together what exactly made her uncomfortable. The scene in front of her seemed off. Ethan, a blonde-haired, fair-skinned boy, clearly didn't look like Vanessa, a dark-skinned woman. Emily had never seen the two together before, and now, she found herself staring, trying to reconcile what she was seeing. At first, it was just a passing thought, perhaps Vanessa was the boy's nanny. But the longer she watched, the more uneasy she felt. The way Vanessa lovingly watched Ethan and the ease with which he smiled back at her, something didn't add up in Emily's mind. As time passed, Emily's discomfort grew into suspicion. She could feel the anxiety building in her chest. The more she watched Vanessa and Ethan, the more she convinced herself that something was wrong. How could a black woman be the mother of a white child? The thought nagged at her. The idea that Vanessa might have abducted Ethan crossed her mind, and once it was there, it wouldn't leave. Her thoughts spiraled, and every interaction between the two seemed suspicious. Emily's heart began to race. She glanced around the park, wondering if anyone else noticed what she was seeing. But the other parents seemed content, oblivious to what Emily perceived as a serious situation. She couldn't shake the feeling that she needed to do something. What if the child wasn't safe? What if the boy was in trouble, and no one was stepping in to help? Emily's mind was racing. She had always prided herself on being a protector in the community. She had been involved in numerous situations where her vigilance had helped others, and she wasn't about to ignore something that could be dangerous for the child. Her thoughts kept returning to the possibility that Vanessa wasn't supposed to have Ethan, that the boy had been taken by her. The conclusion seemed logical, and the fear of being wrong felt insignificant compared to the need to act. Before she fully realized it, Emily reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the dialer and hesitated for just a moment. But in her mind, she was doing the right thing, protecting a child. That was what mattered. She quickly pressed the numbers and waited as the line rang. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice was calm, but Emily's voice was laced with urgency as she explained the situation. I'm at the park, and I think something's wrong. There's a black woman here with a white child, and it doesn't seem right. The child might not be hers. Can you send someone to check it out?" Her words came out in a rush, filled with the conviction that she was doing what was necessary. Emily glanced at Vanessa again as she spoke, her eyes narrowing in concern. She didn't see Vanessa as a loving mother in that moment. Instead, she saw her as a potential threat, an outsider. In her mind, she was saving Ethan from danger. She gave the operator the location and hung up, feeling a mix of nerves and self-righteousness. Now, all she had to do was wait. The police would sort things out, and if she was wrong, no harm done. But if she was right, she would have saved a child. As she sat back down, Emily didn't notice the curious glances from other parents in the park. She was too focused on the idea that she had done the right thing. Her eyes remained locked on Vanessa and Ethan, and every smile, every laugh from the boy only deepened her belief that something was amiss. She was oblivious to the true harm that her actions were about to cause, both for Vanessa and for herself. The sense of satisfaction that came from believing she had protected a child blinded her to the deeper implications of her actions. Little did she know, the regret she would soon feel was something she could never have anticipated. The sound of sirens cut through the peaceful chatter of the park, turning heads as 2 police cars pulled up to the playground. Parents who had been minding their own business moments earlier now stood up, curious about what was happening. Vanessa, initially unaware of the commotion, continued to watch Ethan play, but when she saw the officers walking purposefully toward her, her heart sank. She had no idea why they were approaching, but something in their demeanor told her that this wasn't a simple matter. As the officers neared, Vanessa's pulse quickened. Ethan, noticing the sudden change in his mother's expression, stopped playing and ran to her, his small hands slipping into hers. The officers, a man and a woman, greeted Vanessa with polite but firm tones. Her confusion quickly turned into shock as they explained the reason for their presence. One of the officers glanced at Emily, who was standing a few feet away, arms crossed, her face lined with concern. "We've received a report," the male officer began, trying to keep his voice neutral. "There's been a call about the welfare of this child. We need to ask you a few questions to verify the situation." Vanessa blinked, her mind struggling to catch up with the words. "A call? About my son?" Her voice wavered as the reality began to sink in. She looked down at Ethan, who was now gripping her hand even tighter, his face scrunched in confusion. The female officer took a step forward. "We were told there's a possibility this child may not belong to you. We're just here to make sure everything is okay." Vanessa's mouth went dry as she realized what was happening. Her gaze shifted to Emily, who stood nearby, her eyes still locked on Vanessa and Ethan as if she were waiting for the truth to come out. Vanessa felt her stomach turn. "What are you saying?" she asked, her voice growing quieter. "Are you saying someone thinks I kidnapped my own son?" The male officer nodded cautiously. "We need to clarify the situation. It's standard procedure in cases like this." At those words, Vanessa's heart dropped. She looked down at Ethan, who was staring up at her, wide-eyed and scared. "Mommy, are we in trouble?" he whispered, his small voice trembling. Vanessa crouched down to his level, trying to muster a reassuring smile, but it felt forced, hollow. "No, honey," she said softly, even though her chest was tight with anxiety. "Everything's going to be okay." But inside, Vanessa was reeling. How could this be happening? She had faced prejudice before, but never like this. The idea that someone thought she had kidnapped Ethan, that her love for her son could be questioned so casually, it was too much to bear. The weight of the accusation pressed down on her, but she knew she had to stay calm. For Ethan. Vanessa stood up, squaring her shoulders, though the nervous energy in her body threatened to overwhelm her. "Ethan is my son," she said firmly. "I adopted him 3 years ago. I have all the paperwork with me if you need it." The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions remaining professional but tinged with skepticism. "We'll need to see those documents," the male officer said. Vanessa nodded, her hands shaking slightly as she reached into her bag to pull out Ethan's adoption papers. She handed them over, her eyes never leaving Ethan, who was now holding onto her leg. The female officer began looking through the papers, but even as she scanned them, Vanessa could feel the judgmental stares from other parents in the park. The once friendly atmosphere had shifted, and she felt as though she were standing under a spotlight, her every move scrutinized. The skeptical glances from the officers only made it worse. It was as though the truths she lived with every day, the love she had for her son, the family they had built together, was suddenly up for debate, reduced to a set of papers and appearances. Vanessa took a deep breath, willing herself to stay composed. She had nothing to hide. Ethan was her son, and no one could take that away from her. Still, the situation felt like a personal attack, as if her identity as a mother was being questioned. Her stomach churned with a mix of anger and fear. Emily, meanwhile, remained close, watching the exchange unfold with a look of grim satisfaction. She genuinely believed she had done the right thing. "I was just trying to protect him," she said, stepping closer. Her voice carried a tone of justification. "You have to understand, it didn't look right. A black woman with a white child, it's not something you see every day." Vanessa's jaw clenched at the words. The ignorance behind them was staggering. "You didn't see a mother and son," she replied, her voice tight with controlled anger. "You saw a problem where there wasn't one. You made an assumption based on the color of my skin, not the reality of our lives." Emily, still believing she had acted in the child's best interest, shook her head. "I couldn't just ignore it. What if something had been wrong? I had to act. You understand that, right?" Vanessa stared at her, struggling to comprehend how Emily could be so blind to the harm she had caused. The officers, sensing the tension, handed Vanessa back her documents. "Everything checks out," the male officer said, his tone neutral but with an underlying sense of awkwardness. "We're sorry for the inconvenience." Vanessa nodded, though the apology felt hollow. "It's fine," she said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. "I understand you have a job to do." But as the officers turned to leave, Vanessa couldn't help but feel the deep sting of what had just happened. The stares from the other parents, the assumptions made about her and Ethan, the way she had been reduced to defending her right to be his mother, it was a kind of pain she wouldn't forget easily. Emily stood there, arms still crossed, watching as the police walked away. In her mind, she had done what any good citizen would have done. She believed she was protecting a child, even though, in reality, all she had done was tear open a wound of racial bias that Vanessa had long grown accustomed to navigating. Vanessa sat on the bench, staring blankly ahead as the police cars pulled away. The tension from the confrontation still hung heavy in the air. Ethan sat beside her, clinging to her arm, sensing something was wrong but too young to fully understand. Her mind felt scattered, trying to piece together what had just happened. The relief of being cleared by the police did nothing to ease the ache in her chest. They may have left, but the damage had already been done. She had just been forced to prove she was Ethan's mother in front of strangers, her identity, her love for her son, questioned because of the color of her skin. Ethan looked up at her, his innocent blue eyes wide with confusion. "Mommy, why were the police here? Did we do something bad?" His voice was small, his fear barely masked. Vanessa's heart broke. What could she say? She had promised to protect him, to shield him from the ugliness of the world, but here they were, confronted by it in broad daylight. "No, baby, we didn't do anything wrong," Vanessa whispered, pulling him close. "Sometimes people make mistakes, they don't always understand. But we're okay. You're okay." She tried to sound reassuring, but her words felt inadequate. She knew Ethan needed more of an explanation, but how could she explain this to a 5-year-old? How could she tell him that some people would never see their family as legitimate, that there would always be those who judged them based on their appearances alone? As Ethan snuggled into her, seemingly satisfied with her answer for now, Vanessa's mind raced. This wasn't the first time she had faced prejudice, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. The microaggressions, the questioning glances, the casual comments people made without thinking, they had all been part of her life for as long as she could remember. She had dealt with it growing up, as a young woman, and even more so after adopting Ethan. She had braced herself for the stares, for the questions, for the moments when strangers would assume she was his nanny or that they couldn't possibly be related. But this, having the police called on her in a public park, was a new level of pain. Vanessa thought back to the day she decided to adopt Ethan. She had known it would come with challenges, particularly as a black woman adopting a white child. But her love for him, her desire to be his mother, had overridden any fears she had about how others might perceive their family. She had prepared herself for difficult conversations, for the judgment that would inevitably come from certain corners of society. But no amount of preparation could have readied her for the humiliation of today. Having to prove, in front of Ethan and strangers, that she had the right to be his mother, this was a hurt she hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just the confrontation that weighed on her. It was the realization that this wouldn't be the last time something like this happened. Ethan was still young, still innocent, unaware of the complexities of race and prejudice. But as he grew older, he would begin to see. He would start asking more questions. And one day, he would fully understand what had happened today. How would she protect him then? How would she shield him from the inevitable sting of the world's assumptions about their family? Vanessa's heart ached, not just for herself, but for the future she knew Ethan would have to navigate. Meanwhile, across the park, Emily stood in the same spot where she had made the phone call. She watched as the other parents, who had previously been content with idle gossip, now kept their distance from her. The satisfaction she had initially felt from taking action had long since faded. It had been replaced by something far more uncomfortable: guilt. One of the mothers who had been nearby earlier approached her, shaking her head in disapproval. "Emily, what were you thinking?" she asked, her tone sharp but not unkind. "That's her son. She didn't deserve that." Emily, still trying to process the situation, felt a pit forming in her stomach. I thought something was wrong," she stammered. "I was just trying to protect the boy." But as the words left her mouth, they felt hollow, and she knew it. She had convinced herself earlier that she was acting out of concern, but now it was painfully clear that her fear had been driven by something else, something uglier. The other mother gave her a sympathetic but firm look. "You have to be careful, Emily. You can't just assume the worst because of how someone looks. That wasn't fair." With that, she walked away, leaving Emily standing alone, grappling with the consequences of her actions. The more Emily thought about it, the more her guilt intensified. She had watched Vanessa and Ethan from afar, letting her biases cloud her judgment. She hadn't seen a mother and son, she had seen something that didn't fit her narrow view of what a family should look like. And because of that, she had involved the police, causing unnecessary pain to an innocent woman and her child. Emily's hands trembled as the weight of her actions settled on her shoulders. She hadn't protected anyone. All she had done was expose her own prejudice, and now she regretted it deeply. As Emily watched Vanessa from across the park, she could feel the shame building within her. What had she done? She had disrupted a peaceful day for a mother and her child, all because she couldn't see past their skin color. The realization hit her like a wave, and for the first time, she began to truly understand the gravity of her mistake. The next day, Emily couldn't shake the guilt that had settled in her chest. The memory of the previous day weighed heavily on her, and she knew she couldn't simply ignore it. She had to make things right. After spending the night wrestling with her thoughts, Emily decided that an apology was necessary. She couldn't undo what she had done, but she could try to take responsibility for it. As she walked back to the park, the same place where the confrontation had unfolded, her steps felt heavy with uncertainty. What if Vanessa didn't want to hear her apology? What if the damage she had caused was irreparable? Emily spotted Vanessa and Ethan near the swings again, just as they had been the day before. Her heart raced as she approached them, her palms damp with nerves. Vanessa glanced up as she neared, her expression neutral but her eyes cautious. Emily swallowed hard, gathering her courage. "Vanessa, can I talk to you for a minute?" she asked quietly, her voice laced with hesitation. Vanessa nodded slowly, standing up from the bench as Ethan continued playing nearby. Emily took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her words before she spoke. "I want to apologize for what I did yesterday," she began, her voice shaky. "I made an assumption, and it was wrong. I was completely out of line to call the police. I thought I was doing the right thing, but now I realize that I wasn't protecting anyone. I was just letting my fears get the better of me." Her eyes flickered toward Ethan, who was happily oblivious to the tension between the two women. "I know that I hurt you and your son, and I am so sorry for that. I didn't think about what my actions would mean for you, and I deeply regret causing you any pain." Emily's voice cracked with emotion as she finished, and she stood there, waiting, unsure of what to expect in return. Vanessa listened in silence, her face unreadable at first. Apologies like this weren't new to her, and too often they felt hollow, an easy way for someone to assuage their guilt without fully understanding the damage they'd caused. But something in Emily's demeanor gave her pause. There was no deflection, no excuses, just genuine regret. Vanessa could see that Emily was struggling to come to terms with her own actions, and while that didn't erase the hurt, it made the apology feel real. Still, Vanessa wasn't ready to let go of the anger that had been building inside her since the incident. "You think an apology is enough?" she asked, her voice steady but tinged with frustration. "You called the police on me. You made me prove that I'm my own son's mother. Do you understand what that did to him? What that did to me?" Emily winced at the rawness in Vanessa's words. She nodded, biting her lip as she struggled to find the right response. "I know. I can't imagine what that must have felt like," she admitted quietly. I wasn't thinking clearly. I let my own fears cloud my judgment." Vanessa crossed her arms, taking a deep breath. "You didn't think, and now my son's going to remember that his mother was questioned by police because of the color of her skin. He's going to remember that there are people in the world who look at us and see something wrong, even when we're just living our lives." Her voice trembled, the emotions she had been holding back finally surfacing. Emily stood there, feeling the weight of every word Vanessa spoke. She wanted to say something, anything, that would make things better, but there was nothing that could erase what had happened. "I wish I could take it back," Emily said softly. "I really do. And I know saying sorry doesn't fix it, but I am truly sorry." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Vanessa looked away, her thoughts swirling. She had heard apologies before, but they often came with excuses or attempts to downplay the harm. This one felt different. Emily wasn't asking for forgiveness, she was acknowledging her mistake and owning it. Vanessa sighed, the tension in her shoulders easing ever so slightly. "It's not easy for me to just forgive," she said finally. "But I appreciate that you're trying to understand." Emily nodded, grateful that Vanessa was even willing to have the conversation. "I want to understand. I really do," she said earnestly. "I didn't realize how much I still had to learn, and I can't expect you to forgive me. But I do want to do better. I want to be better." Vanessa glanced back at Ethan, watching him play, his laughter ringing out in the distance. "Raising a white child as a black mother, it comes with challenges I knew were coming, but sometimes they hit harder than I expect," she admitted, her voice soft. "I've been preparing myself for moments like this, but when it happens in front of my son, it's different. I'm just trying to protect him from the world, and I can't always do that." Emily listened intently, her expression somber as Vanessa spoke. For the first time, Emily began to see just how deep her own biases had run. She had thought she was protecting Ethan, but now she realized she had been protecting herself, from the discomfort of confronting her own prejudices. "I never thought about it that way," Emily said quietly. "I didn't realize how much I was contributing to the problem by making assumptions." Vanessa nodded. "Most people don't. They see us and they judge, and they don't think about the impact of that judgment. But my family is just as valid as any other family. I love my son just as much as any mother would." Emily swallowed hard, feeling the weight of Vanessa's words settle into her chest. She knew this conversation wasn't about her. It was about understanding the harm she had caused and learning how to do better. I want to be part of the solution, Emily said, her voice full of sincerity. I know I've got a lot of work to do, but I'm willing to learn. Vanessa studied her for a moment, seeing the remorse in Emily's eyes. She didn't know if she was ready to forgive, but she could see that Emily was trying. And maybe that was enough for now. I'm not saying everything's okay, Vanessa said cautiously. But I can see you're trying. And that's a start. As the conversation ended, there was no grand moment of resolution, no perfect closure. But there was an understanding, a fragile but real connection between two women who had been on opposite sides of an ugly encounter. The possibility of reconciliation hung in the air, not fully realized, but not out of reach. For now, that was enough. Word of what had happened in the park spread quickly throughout the community. Some parents who had been there that day shared the story with others, and soon it became the topic of conversation in homes, playgrounds, and local shops. People took sides, with some defending Emily's actions, claiming she was just being cautious. Others, however, saw it for what it was, an overreaction rooted in prejudice. The community had always prided itself on being close-knit and progressive, but this incident forced many to confront the uncomfortable reality that bias existed even among them. The local diner, often a place for casual gossip and friendly gatherings, became the center of a more serious discussion. A few concerned parents decided to hold an informal meeting to talk about what had happened, and soon enough, word got around that anyone interested in addressing the issue should attend. The atmosphere was tense when the conversation began, but the room was full. People who had never openly talked about race or prejudice before now found themselves questioning their own assumptions. Vanessa hesitated when she was invited to the gathering. She wasn't sure if she wanted to face the community after what had happened, but something in her told her this was an opportunity to make her voice heard. She also knew that Ethan's future in this community would be shaped by how the people around them understood their family. Emily, too, had received an invitation. Still grappling with her guilt, she decided it was important to be there, even if it meant facing the judgment of her neighbors. As the discussion began, voices rose with a mix of emotions: anger, confusion, guilt. Some parents shared their own experiences with racial bias, while others admitted they hadn't even realized such prejudices still existed in their community. The tension in the room was palpable, but it was clear that people wanted to address what had happened and learn from it. This was no longer just about Vanessa and Emily. It was about the entire community learning to see beyond their comfortable assumptions. When it was finally Emily's turn to speak, she stood, nervous but determined. Her voice was quiet at first, but it grew steadier as she explained why she had made the phone call. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I wasn't, she admitted. I didn't see Vanessa for who she was, a mother, just like me. I saw something different and assumed it was wrong. I let my fears get in the way of seeing the truth, and I regret that more than I can say. There was a silence in the room as her words sank in. Emily's admission of guilt was met with mixed reactions, some nodding in agreement, others looking uneasy, but no one interrupted. It was clear that Emily's mistake had resonated with many of the parents in the room, forcing them to consider how easily they, too, could have jumped to the wrong conclusion. Vanessa, sitting quietly as Emily spoke, felt a wave of emotion rise in her chest. When it was her turn, she stood, her voice calm but firm. This isn't the first time I've faced something like this, and it probably won't be the last, she began. But it hurt more because it happened in front of my son. What happened that day wasn't just about Emily and me. It was about a community that needs to learn to see people for who they really are, not just what they look like. As Vanessa spoke about her experience as a black mother raising a white child, the room shifted. People who had known her for years began to see her in a new light, realizing that her family's challenges were far more complex than they had ever imagined. Vanessa wasn't asking for pity or even forgiveness, she was asking for understanding. And that, more than anything, was what the community needed to hear. The vulnerability from both women began to bridge the divide the incident had created. Emily's willingness to own her mistake, combined with Vanessa's openness about her experiences, created a moment of shared understanding. It wasn't about perfect reconciliation or pretending everything was suddenly fine. It was about starting a conversation that hadn't been happening before. As the meeting wound down, there was a sense that something had shifted. People had come into the diner divided, unsure of how to move forward, but they left with a greater awareness of the biases that lingered in their minds and the work that needed to be done. It wasn't a solution, but it was a beginning. A few days later, Vanessa and Ethan found themselves back at the park. This time, the weight that had lingered over them seemed a little lighter. Ethan ran toward the swings, laughing as he played, while Vanessa watched with a soft smile. Her heart still held the pain from the incident, but she knew that this was just one of many challenges she would face as Ethan's mother. What mattered most to her was that they had each other, and no one could take that away. Vanessa's thoughts drifted to the meeting at the diner. It hadn't been easy, standing in front of her community and sharing her pain. But the conversation that had started was necessary. She could see the subtle changes in the way people looked at her now, less guarded, more understanding. It wasn't perfect, and it wouldn't change everything overnight, but it was progress. And in a world where prejudice often seemed immovable, progress, no matter how small, felt like a victory. She hoped that this incident would be a lesson for the community. That they would start to question their assumptions, to look at people with more compassion and less suspicion. For Vanessa, the most important thing was creating a space where Ethan could grow up feeling safe and loved, not judged for the family he was a part of. As the afternoon sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the park, Vanessa called Ethan over, and they started their walk home. Hand in hand, mother and son walked quietly, the bond between them stronger than ever. Despite everything they had been through, Vanessa felt a sense of hope for the future, not just for her family, but for the community that was learning, little by little, to see beyond the surface. The world wouldn't always be kind, Vanessa knew that. But as long as she had Ethan by her side, and as long as there were people willing to listen and learn, she believed they could face anything together.